I'd like to share a revelation I had recently that ordered my own projects in life into a success column and a failure column just on this one idea. And it's so obvious to me now in hindsight why I failed in so many projects. And I'm hoping I can now use this principle as a path going forward. The idea is very simple, that in any undertaking that you do, you need a plus, an equals, and a minus. The plus is someone who is better, more experienced than you in whatever it is you're doing. An equal, which would be your cohort, your peloton, your crew, and a minus, someone to whom you explain the ideas that you're using, the processes, the algorithms, whatever it is that you're doing. You have to put those ideas in coherent words and messages to explain to somebody else how to do it. It happened in such a random way. I was preparing dinner and was listening to the Perpetual Chess podcast with Ben Johnson, and he was interviewing my student, James Altucher. And James was talking about this idea, and he got it from an MMA fighter named Kevin Shamrock, and this fighter was talking about how he had to learn all of these different styles. So one of the fascinating things about this idea is just how many different people have used it in different ways, and I'm only suddenly coming to learn it now. And one of the things that's so amazing to me is how many different, even small niche areas of my life that I suddenly realized, oh, this applies to it. Now, we're going to talk about chess later, and I think, though, that first, it's just such a powerful idea throughout anybody's life. But if we understand it, how it works in these other areas, I think it becomes more interesting than with chess, and I'll talk about that at the end of this video. So the first example I want to use to talk about what it means with the plus, the equal, and the minus is I have a chess student, a different one, and he is a retired psychiatrist. I was having incredible trouble sleeping. This was even before I understood this idea of the plus, the equal, and the minus. But I realized in my desperation, as so many other people, problems with sleeping, I needed help. And I turned to my friend and I said, look, you got to help me out. And there's an interesting thing about having a plus, and one of the things is you kind of have to surrender your authority for a second. Because you have to trust. There's an element of trusting this person, and there's an element of maybe you don't agree at first. Maybe you don't get it, but you are going to take whatever they say and at least give it a full-bodied attempt. So he gave me a long list of things that I needed to do, but two things in particular, he said, were the most important, and they were also the most difficult. And they were that I needed to get up at the same time every morning, and that I wasn't allowed to nap. And for someone with sleep difficulties, this was enormously difficult, because I would either be exhausted during the day, and then getting up at that time in the morning was very, very hard for me. But this was the key thing that I realized in hindsight from this success, is that only by trusting my friend, that giving him the power, and I call him my sleep sensei now, by giving him the power, I was able to gain control over this area of my life. And just as an example now, we'll talk about some other ones too, but when you think about my cohort, one thing I instantly recognized was I saw these other dads walking around, sleep zombies, man, sleep zombies. And I said to myself, right, I have been that guy, and I know I can return to that guy. And therefore, I can then explain to my friends, these fellow dads, like, look, I can see that you have this problem, and I know how to fix it, and I'm going to try to explain it to you. And so, it's not something with the sleep, it's not like a huge endeavor in that, like, there's thousands of things and there's that you need to do, and there's the huge vector of improvement. There's definitely a vector of improvement, but there's not like it's not something like chess where it's going to be a multi-year accumulation of knowledge. It's some basic habits that you need to acquire. Other examples of life skills that I think everybody needs, a plus equals a minus. You could talk about your relationship to food, whether it's as a gourmand or someone who's interested in health. You can talk about finance. These are all things where we all, whether we think about it consciously or not, we have plus, equals, and minuses, and we need to be aware of those things. Okay, so as a next example, I want to take something from the physical fitness world. I have done so many different things, and this revelation instantly categorized my physical journey between successes and failures. And so, as an example, years ago, simply because there was a gym open near me that was very cheap, I was very poor at the time, I went in there and I engaged in what I would call bro weightlifting culture. And this was a complete failure. It's hilarious in hindsight to me, because everyone else at that gym thought they knew what they were doing. There was no coaches around. There might have been some bro giving advice to you, but there were no coaches around. And it was not clear also what the culture was, not clear what the goals were. It was basically a bunch of dudes in there, some women as well, but people with vague ideas of what success was and very vague ideas about what correct lifting would be. And no one knew. They all thought they did, I as well. There was like a Dunning-Kruger thing going in there, like how hard could it be? How hard could a deadlift be? Everyone was doing it wrong. Everyone was injuring themselves in strange ways, and nobody was making progress, and especially not me. So fast forward many years, decades later, I got encouraged to do weightlifting and CrossFit through the famous Greg Shahada, who is a international master and is posting sometimes on social media about it. And I went for it, and it's like, right, there's a huge difference when you have somebody who's better than you, a cohort of people who are there kind of striving with you, and who you can kind of measure yourself with, and who also have some goals that hopefully are in common. And then some people who are maybe just entering, and even though you're a noob, you can kind of share your knowledge. One of the things that taught me that I really want to stress, and this applies to, I think, every area, is there's a trap that you can fall into, and the fitness communities out there are an example of this, but it really applies to all areas. And that is, if you go into any kind of venue and someone says something like, oh, everybody's different, everybody has different goals, each to his own, everyone has their own needs, their own different journey. That sentiment sounds very true, and I'm sure we've all identified with it at some level. But the interesting thing about the plus, equals, and minus is until you see the commonality between your struggle and your cohort's struggle, you're never going to make any success, because you won't know what success means. There won't be any gradient for which you can both measure yourself on and see your own struggle in those of others. So, for example, I mentioned food earlier on. With fitness, it's honestly all about food. It's one of the ridiculous things that just because you sweat hard, you think that you made improvement, when in fact it was mostly about what you ate. And one of the interesting things about being part of a cohort is if you go home and you realize, no, I'm not going to make any progress unless I eat right, well, then it becomes interesting. Now, one of the things about the fitness communities, before we talk about chess, is just that you need them. And it's kind of astonishing to me, as someone who's very introverted and who likes studying alone, that the social community would be so important. And what it says about humans, I think, whether you're introverted or not, is that ultimately what's driving you is a social interaction, even if you're doing something that's very alone, like chess, maybe, even if it's 99% of your time, the orientation is still social. And that's really remarkable to me. I can say, for example, that the times I've tried to do running alone, never worked. Biking alone, no. You can push yourself a little bit, but you're not going to achieve any kind of success because it's not going to grow organically out of a community. And ultimately, you're not going to understand what your goals are, because goals are, this is the interesting part, defined in a communal way. For example, our chess rating system. And there's so many other, one of the other things that's interesting to think about fitness goals and chess goals is most fitness communities have some kind of metric to measure whatever it is that they are doing. And that metric, though, is like fundamentally, it's something that grows out of whatever community it's in. Okay. Before I talk about chess, I want to say one of the failures I've had is that I've always been interested in reading. And reading is a funny business because it's very ill-defined. What you read and what you're doing it for. I mostly am interested in expanding my mind in a variety of ways. History, philosophy, science, all kinds of stuff I'm interested in. And one of the things in hindsight that this plus equals and minus really gave me is the success that inspired my academic career when I had one was really as an undergraduate when we were reading all kinds of things and then we were talking about it, and then you had to write some kind of paper. And there was a plus and equal, and often there was a minus if I was teaching somebody, I don't know, how to write or whatever it was on the side. And now, outside of that kind of structured environment, it is very difficult to find any purpose, any driven purpose with something like reading. Like, what is it we're going to read? What kind of critical thoughts are you going to have, especially if they're not directed towards some kind of conversation? Like, are you going to write a review on Goodreads or something? That's nice, but it's not being part of a community. And so that's an example where this plus equals and minus immediately showed me, right, that's why you've been floundering for decades now in your writing in your reading culture, because it hasn't had a community to thrive within. Okay, let's talk about chess. And one of the mind-blowing things that this revelation turned me onto is it answered a question I've had for my whole life. And that is, why were the Russians so good? And there was all kinds of answers like the Soviet chess school and blah, blah, blah. I'm calling BS on it all right now. It's very clear in hindsight what was going on. There was communities within the Soviet system, still are in Russia, where you had a system of coaches, of then players who then coached others, of players who then wrote their analyses up and then were subject to review by other people. And it was that culture which gave a sense of what the chess life meant and what the important metrics might be, and also what a chess culture in itself might represent, what honors it had and what it meant to have honor within that society. Very interesting. And if you contrast it to, say, the chess culture I grew up with, which was very alone, and one of the reasons I'm so interested now in doing stuff with the U.S. Chess School, it's now kind of an online thing that Greg Shahada is now running, is because I have a memory of coming as this kid who had no access to chess culture to New York City and going and playing like the U.S. under 16 at the Manhattan Chess Club, or doing a camp at the Marshall Chess Club, and then being introduced to some kind of grandmaster, and there was a gravitas there. And maybe it didn't even last that long, but it was a grandmaster had some gravitas who showed us some things. And then there was a cohort, a very interesting cohort of kids who I then could identify my own struggles with, maybe measure myself against them. And then there would be a structure of like, oh, these are things that you can do to improve your game. And it wouldn't just be the person above you that's telling you this, but it would be your cohort. You'd be talking about stuff. Hey, what tournament you playing next? That whole kind of thing. And then finally, it's really important. This is something that I realized years ago, but I didn't put it into this revelation of the plus and the equals and the minus, is one of the very key reasons I became a GM was that I taught and that I made videos. You know, early on, this was in the early 2000s, one of the first people to do chess videos. And that process of forcing myself to articulate what it was I was thinking was essential in getting my own brain straight about what I was doing on the chessboard. So critical. And I wasn't doing it with the intention of improving. I was doing it out of vanity and economic necessity. And so now, like, for example, when I'm forcing myself to make this video today, I'm truly forcing myself to try to articulate what this revelation means to me, because I know that forcing myself to do it will make myself clearer about it and also create more of a commitment on my end to doing the things I'm saying. And that's the same thing when you're teaching. When you are preaching something, you are committing yourself to some kind of plan as well. Don't ever take a class from a teacher who is not doing whatever it is they're teaching. And finally, what I'd like to end with is just what failure looks like, because I think it's very important to leave with this image. There were so many times, especially on an intellectual level, where what failure was like when my mind and soul were like this nut that was all alone. Nothing was coming in from above because I was either too proud or maybe I didn't have any money for a teacher, and nothing was going out below, right? I wasn't saying anything about it. For example, I'm sure many of you out there either have had the following experience or know this person. They're like a PhD student and they won't talk about what it is they're doing. They can't. They're stuck up in this nut. They're not willing to divulge anything. And that is a sure sign that nothing positive is happening within that person's journey at that moment. It is a very sure sign. And to me, it's so interesting that all of these things, whether it's a life question like sleep or finance or whatever, to the physical, to the intellectual world, and honestly, even little skills like, learning to type. All these little things all come down to whether or not you have a plus, an equal, or a minus. And I'll probably talk a little bit more about this as it relates to chess in future videos, but I just wanted to put that out there, and I hope you found it helpful too.